Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's William R. Stewart Memorial Lecture for Labor and Employment Law. Established in 2006, this lecture honors the late Bill Stewart, who is one of our most distinguished graduates. A veteran of the United States Army, he earned his JD here in 1959. 40 years later, he was inducted to the school's Academy of Law Academy Fellows, the highest and most distinguished honor we can bestow upon one of our graduates. For 34 years, Bill was a lawyer for the National Labor Relations Board and was the board's first African-American chief counsel. His leadership and commitment to excellence prompted President Bill Clinton to award him the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service and to characterize his contributions to the NLRB as unparalleled. At the time, he was the first and only NLRB employee, its entire 69-year history, to receive this honor, the highest honor that any civil servant can receive. Past Stewart lectures have been some of the most prominent labor and employment scholars in the nation. They include Laura J. Cooper from the University of Minnesota, Martin Mallon from the Chicago-Kent College of Law, Matt Finken from the University of Illinois, Sam Bagenstos from Michigan Law, and our last speaker, Cynthia Estlin from NYU. This year, we're very pleased to add Professor Sturm, and that she will give this year's Stewart Lecture. Professor Sturm is the George M. Jaffin Professor of Law and of Social Responsibility and the founding director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia Law School. She is one of the nation's leading experts on initiatives aimed at increasing full participation related to issues of inclusion and institutional change. At Columbia, she teaches an innovative course on lawyer leadership, leading self, leading others, leading change, to enable aspiring lawyers to engage in difficult conversations and work effectively with others to achieve common goals. Professor Sturm is a prolific scholar and has published a wide range of articles, case studies, and books on the architecture of inclusion, institutional change, transformative leadership, workplace equality, legal education, and inclusion and diversity in higher education. She was a founding member of the Presidential Advisory Committee on Diversity at Columbia University. She is also the principal investigator for 2 Ford Foundation grants awarded to develop strategies for advancing post-secondary education for communities affected by incarceration, as well as to immigrants and veterans. She holds a bachelor's from Brown and a law degree from Yale. In 2007, she received Columbia's Presidential Teaching Award for outstanding teaching. We're very pleased that she's joined us here in Bloomington, and I hope you'll join me in the very warmest welcome for Professor Susan Sturm.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I was so thrilled to see that the Northeast is not the only place in the country with such beautiful fall foliage. I'm very grateful to Deborah Wittes for inviting me. We had a wonderful connection in Australia, in Melbourne, where we first connected around these issues of race and gender and institutional change. It's wonderful to see a group of people who are interested in issues of equality. These are issues that law and legal institutions have really been called upon to address. And I don't know how many of you came to law school, whether faculty or students, because you had some interest in using the law to address issues of inequality. Anyone in the room? Yeah, I figured you might have, right? Me too. I don't know about you. I know that for me, both as a student and as a scholar, if I didn't know it so much before law school because I'm a first-generation student, so I didn't know much of anything before I came to law school. But I quickly learned that law's relationship to addressing inequality is far more complicated than I had recognized before I went to law school. I would say it's pretty safe to say that we're much better at identifying the problems of inequality than we are at figuring out what law and lawyers can do to address them. So we can bring lawsuits that identify discriminatory patterns and practices, but the law has only so much power and also willingness to address those kinds of patterns in the context of litigation, and even in the context of workplace efforts to address inequality. So there are abundance of studies that document disparities around race and gender. but not so many that actually look in a systematic and rigorous way about what to do to actually advance equality. And we have lots of programs, right? We have tons of programs: diversity, implicit bias, mentorship, affirmative action, and yet we've made limited progress. And I think we can say that safely about both legal education and also about courts and the way that our judicial systems operate, and about the legal profession. I think we could also say it's easier to say what we don't like, what's unjust, what's discriminatory, than it is to say, what do we want our institutions to look like if they're actually inclusive, if they're actually fully participatory? And we also have limited understanding of the dynamics, how to actually address dynamics that are deeply rooted in culture, which so many of the issues of involving race, gender, and other aspects of difference really rest in. As one management consultant said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Right? So and I can say we now with your show of hands, right? We face a series of contradictions as we try to address issues of race, gender, disability, all different categories of bias. Legal institutions are both part of the problem, and they're also this part of the solution. Many turn to courts and lawyers to address stuck patterns of exclusion and bias, and yet legal institutions themselves exhibit some of these same kinds of patterns. So they're responsible for changing patterns that also affect the way in which they operate. We can also see that women and people of color now occupy many more positions of leadership, including they were President of the United States. Look at the presidential candidates running now for office on the Democratic side. And at the same time, we see persistent and growing inequality in the context of race and gender. We are simultaneously increasing our capacity to address subtle third-generation forms of bias and discrimination, at the same time that we're seeing a resurgence of what I've called first-generation discrimination, in a way that I would say actually has quite shocked me. We see leaders of legal institutions saying and expressing and meaning very deep commitment to really advancing diversity and addressing issues of inclusion, even as they hold on to, and I'd say we hold on to, policies and practices that lock in place those very patterns. So what do we do with these contradictions? What do we do with these contradictions? More importantly, how do we make progress towards greater equality and full participation in the face of these contradictory patterns, these contradictory dynamics? I would say that question has formed the focus of the bulk of my career, is really trying to address that question. And I've been doing this as a scholar, as an action researcher, somebody who goes into institutions to try to use a combination of research and capacity building to address these kinds of issues, and also as a teacher. So just to give you an illustration of where what I'm going to talk about comes from, over the past 10 years or so, I've been working with court systems. I've been working in particular with one court system that has really taken on as its commitment to improve their capacity to deal effectively with issues of race, gender, language, other aspects of bias. I've also worked with law schools and law journals that have recognized the ways in which they are operating in ways that are not fully participatory for women, people of color, public interest-oriented students, others in the law school. And then law firms and legal organizations, both big law and public defenders and prosecutors that also face these kinds of dynamics. I've often got involved because there's been some kind of a study or a crisis that demonstrates that the institution, notwithstanding its efforts, 10 years of efforts, is still facing very entrenched patterns. So the court system, for example, there is a huge disconnect between the demographics of the court personnel and the demographics of the people who come before the court. This is a state court system. So 12% of the trial justices, the trial court justices, were non-white. 6% of the clerk magistrates were non-white, whereas the three of the highest volume courts, 52, 42, and 65% of the people who are court users were non-white. Access and fairness surveys demonstrating that there's a big disparity in the perception of fairness of the court system between white court users and non-white court users. And similarly, the law journal and law school asked me to get involved after there was a huge outcry when all of the board members of the journal that year, this was 2012, was white men. And also, there were very few, there were only 2 students who identified as Black and African American, and none who identified as Latinx, who were on the law journal, and very few submitting articles. They noticed a disparity also in the publications. So they were doing a conventional, important disparities analysis. There's a disparity between the pool and the people who are actually participating, and that has serious implications for us. They'd done all the usual things. They'd done all of the diversity programs and they still had this issue. And so they reached out to me based on work that I've done in the past to bring a kind of action research perspective to see what they could do to try to move the needle on these kinds of issues. So what I've done has been to work with these institutions to really reshape the way in which they're asking questions, reshape the frame that they're bringing to these institutions. And so I've worked with them first to understand how culture actually affects their institutions, really looking at how people of all different backgrounds and races and identities move through these systems, to try to understand, not by starting in advance and presuming what the dynamics are, but actually looking at who succeeds and thrives in these institutions, and then what patterns do we glean from that, both about success and thriving generally, and about success and thriving as they affect groups that are differentially experiencing success and thriving in the institution. And doing that by looking at these very important critical junctures that affect how people actually participate in the court system, in the law school, in the law journal, in the law firm, or the legal organization. I've also worked with these organizations to reframe the way in which they actually think about these issues. So they're not only using a disparities approach, they're using what I call a kind of both-and approach, which I'll say a little bit about more, but that is an approach that asks simultaneously who is succeeding and thriving in this institution and what is really critical to our mission connected to success and thriving, and at the same time, how are people of different groups faring in the institution? So we're asking a question that is both key to the organization's purpose and mission. For the court system, it was justice with speed and dignity. For the law journal, it was both getting a good, prestigious credential and also having impact through legal scholarship. And at the same time, connecting that purpose to questions about what groups are and are not thriving under those definitions. So part of what I've learned is the importance of capacity building. So that's also something else I've been doing with these organizations, in addition to studying, really working with individuals and groups for them to build their capacity to actually hold these kinds of contradictions, and also to redesign their way of working. So I want to just give you a sense of how I got there, to focus on these things: action research to understand the culture, capacity building to help these people throughout the organizations, particularly leadership, all different through these organizations, to be able to address these contradictions, and then reframing the way in which they think about these issues, and finally really redesigning the way they interact so that they have the accountability structures in place to move forward. So this will get more concrete. I'll give you some more illustrations. But part of what I've learned in this work is that a very valuable way to reframe these contradictions is to think about them as paradoxes. And I've learned that there's a whole kind of research agenda that is focused on this question of paradox. So what's a paradox? A paradox is a statement or a proposition or an experience that has two conflicting positions that are opposing each other, but that are also interdependent. That you can't actually hold them both at the same time, but you actually have to. Like working in a group, you want to preserve your individual identity, and you also want to connect deeply to the group. And so there's a paradox that you're simultaneously cycling back and forth between trying to define your identity individually in opposition to the group, and then trying to connect with the group in a deep way. So that's an example of a paradox. And there are a series of paradoxes that actually affect our capacity to address race and gender. And we often have treated these paradoxes as dilemmas where we have to pick one or the other, or we choose one or the other. And one of the things about paradoxes is that you can't avoid both sides. You have to deal with both sides of a paradox. If you try to avoid one, they just come back and assert it in some way that you haven't actually taken account for. So I've identified a set of paradoxes that actually affect the way in which we address race and gender, our capacity to address race and gender. And so one move that seems to actually make a big difference is to actually identify these contradictions, these tensions, as paradoxes. And then the next move is to figure out what to do about them, right? So one paradox is the perception paradox. So people, if you had this experience, people respond in very different ways to exactly the same thing, often in ways that might correlate to their group identity, like race or gender. So in Massachusetts, if we defined the work that we were doing in terms of race, gender, and diversity, there were a group of very important leaders who would not come into the room. Or if they did, they would be resentful. Because they say, people call them the all set crowd. I'm all set. I've done the diversity training. I know how to do this. I don't need to hear anymore. And if you make me come on something that I don't think has anything to do with me, because I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, then I'm going to really sit there and steam for the entire time and resist and actually turn against these kinds of efforts. So there's a push then to bring people into the room around a frame like leadership or fair justice for all. But if you do that, the employees of color, the judges of color, the community members of color, the probation officers respond by saying, you know, you're not really serious. We've been experiencing these patterns around race and gender for decades, and you can't even name it? I don't have any confidence in this initiative. So here you have this paradox that, at least at an organizational level, you have to simultaneously speak in terms of race and gender and not speak in terms of race and gender, right? There's also another version of this is that people feel actually in contradictory ways about whether they want to speak in terms of race and gender. So if you share data, for example, that how many of you have come across the implicit bias research and know about implicit bias, something about that? So that data which suggests everyone's biased. Everyone has a bias. We live in a world that's structured by race and gender and age and political affiliation, and we're all biased. So if you tell some people that information in an effort to get them to really take these issues seriously, some people will respond to that information by saying, yes, this is really urgent, this is really important, we have to do something. And some people respond to that same information by saying, wow, everyone does this. It's not my fault. I don't need to deal with it. So if you use the same strategy to try to get people to urgently engage with the issue, you're going to get some people in, you're going to push some people out. Another paradox. So then there's the identity paradox, and this is really a challenge that Martha Minow has really called this the difference dilemma, but that people simultaneously want to and need to identify with their group identity and also resist identifying with their group identity. And so creating single identity spaces, affinity groups, or opportunities for people to engage in working with people who are from the same, critically important. And at the same time, we heard, for example, in the research on the Yale Law Journal, that there were many students of color who really kind of resisted the being pigeonholed only in terms of a single identity, and really found it problematic to identify only, or sometimes primarily in terms of their identity. And both things were true even about the same person. And then you have the same kind of challenge around people who, white folks who are interested in addressing these issues, but then learn about what they don't know and say, I don't know what I don't know. I don't really want to deal with these issues because I know I'm going to have a problem dealing with these issues. So as soon as I learn about my identity as having white privilege, my response is to essentially step away and say, I can't really be at the table. So here's another paradox. Then we have the legalization paradox. And this is a paradox that's really particular to us in legal institutions, that at the same time that we absolutely need compliance-oriented, accountability-focused, sanction-driven efforts to address race and bias. Those very same, because there's people who are engaged in behavior that if you don't deal with someone who's a serial harasser, or you don't deal with someone who's overtly engaging in race or sex or religious discrimination, nothing else you do will be legitimate. And at the same time, these same kinds of compliance practices can close down the willingness to take the risks you need to take to really understand race and gender, and to really engage with people who are different than you are. And so we saw that happening in the trial court, that in the morning, they would go to a workshop where they were told, take the risk, engage with race and gender, talk to people, create the conditions under which you're actually going to be able to have these kinds of conversations, whether it's with your staff or with court users. And in the afternoon, they were visited by counsel who said to them, be very careful what you say, and if anyone complains, you may no longer talk about this because now there's investigation, so you have to refer it to legal. And so they're like, what do we do? How do we actually navigate this contradiction? And that's complicated by another paradox that we've already gestured at, which is this justice paradox underneath the legalization paradox, which is that we are relying on justice institutions, courts, to address these issues at the same time that we're deeply critical of the capacity of these justice institutions to address these kinds of problems. And we can't escape that. We can't escape that paradox. It's kind of built in to our Constitution. It's built into, this is premised on freedom and equality at a time of slavery. It's kind of built in to our whole structure of government. And then the final paradox is this culture paradox, which is that if you try to introduce a program that's a small win, that you can actually get progress on and make progress on in the short run, and you don't address culture, the culture will eat the program for breakfast. And if you try to introduce a culture change initiative, which has it's threatening, it's big, it's systemic, it's messy, then people are like, count me out. I don't want to have anything to do. I don't believe you can change cultures anyway. And I don't really want to be involved in this. So this is another paradox, right? So what do we do? What do we do with all this? I think our conventional strategies can be to ignore this or treat the paradox as if it doesn't exist, pick one side or the other. And then you can see, because you can't do one without the other. You can't actually produce culture change if you don't have a program that will move people forward. But if you don't do culture change, then you can't move a program forward in a way that will actually address the underlying issues. So what we've learned through this work is that there are a set of strategies. I didn't want to leave you there, I promise. That would be really cruel, right? What can you do? Nothing, right? Just live with it, deal with it, right? Yeah. That actually, partly this research and partly really engaging with people who are really committed and stuck and wanting to move forward has identified a set of strategies that can actually move us forward to be able to make progress. And these are these four different strategies, and I'll just touch on them briefly because I really want to make sure that there's time for questions so we can go into more illustrations. So one of them we've already seen, which is to reframe these contradictions as paradoxes. And it's really been interesting to me to watch what happens with my students and also with judges and probation officers and clerks when they reconceptualize these contradictions as paradoxes. With my students, I get, it's almost like a sigh of relief in the sense that they felt like they had to figure it out. And if they couldn't figure it out, then they wouldn't be able to be effective at all. And of course, there's no way to figure these things out. You have to live with them. So just the idea of recognizing that part of what you need to do is understand that you have to find a way to do two things that look opposite, not necessarily at the same moment, but over time. And to think about how you can do that. And so the question is then, what does that look like besides just noticing it? And I teach civil procedure also, and this comes up a lot in civil procedure, right? You're simultaneously having to cooperate and compete, right? You're simultaneously having to impose rules and invite people to actually take responsibility for remedies. So this is built in to what we do as lawyers. We don't necessarily prepare ourselves very well for navigating that, but it is built into what we do as lawyers. So one thing that we can do is this both and reframe, which is to reframe, and this is part of what I did with the law journal and with the court system, is to reframe the issue as not just an issue about reducing disparities or eliminating bias, but to help them identify two sides of an interconnected vision. And importantly, this is something that's not only negative, not only what we want to move away from, but what we want to move to. So on one side, what are the purposes or the priorities or the pain points that relate to interaction, success, and thriving? And so for the court system, part of what was really striking is there's so much commitment on the part of people throughout the system to actually administering justice. And this is one of the reasons I think there's some hope for us in the legal profession. And that might be harder in some other professions, or maybe to the extent that law firms have become really commercialized, where the bottom line is driving everything. I think this becomes harder. But in organizations that take responsibility for some aspect of justice, of really having an impact as officers of the court, we do have purposes and priorities that are connected in a deep way to figuring out how to create systems that are fair, systems that operate justly, systems where people can be heard, systems where conflict can be addressed. And that side of the ledger actually connects with what is the way in which those processes are or are not working for groups that we can say are systematically not thriving, not succeeding, not experiencing justice. So making that move to full participation as a frame that has both an affirmative side and a critical side really shifted things for both the court and also for the journal. For the Yale Law Journal, we really want to have publications with impact. We don't just want to be putting out a journal that nobody reads. And we want it to bring in people who care about having impact. And that changed the way in which the journal was talking with students about whether they would want to participate on the journal. Because it turns out that women and people of color and public interest-oriented students and first-generation students were really interested in writing if they could write for impact and not just for a credential. So that's one move, is the reframe. And part of what the reframe does, it gives you a reason for holding these two contradictory things together, right? Why would we try to do this hard work of doing something that's in tension with this other thing, and that would have us having to speak with people who are put off by addressing issues of race, while we're also speaking to people who need to address issues of race or gender in order for an initiative to actually have legitimacy. So the framework gives a way to keep these two sides of the paradox together. A second piece of what, and this is actually, we can come back to this, but this is what it looked like for the Yale Law Journal, success and thriving, and the way in which they were able to do this and think about this in a different way that really changed the way they were doing a lot of their practices. A second piece of this is around building capacity. There are these capacities which are listed up here, but there are capacities that are actually very important for lawyering, period, and also for leadership, period, but that also build the capacity to hold paradox. And these include, any of you heard of something like a growth mindset? Is that something that anyone's heard about? There's a psychologist, Carol Dweck, who's really introduced to this idea of approaching things with a growth mindset, something that can be very challenging to do in law school and in the legal profession. But turns out it's really important to being able to hold paradox and deal with failure. Self-awareness is actually something that can be learned. It's something that can be practiced. And something that's critically important for being able to hold the discomfort of holding two contradictory ideas at the same time. Building the reflective capacity, again, something that can be very difficult to do in law school when you've got a billion things to do and not enough time, and also in a very busy court system, but is critically important to this idea. Any of you ever heard of this thing called immunity to change? Did anyone ever hear that? It's a whole strategy for how you actually deal with advancing something that's really important to you when you've been doing the opposite because you have some kind of competing commitment that you're not even aware of. And it turns out when you learn to do something like this, you also learn how to hold paradox. So there are these series of ways, then there's systems thinking and design thinking that also connects actually creativity with choice and strategy. And then there's cultural competency. So, and it turns out that, that by learning, so any of you seen this visual before? So what do you see when you look at this? Any of you seeing a vase? Any of you seeing two faces? Can you see the vase and the two faces at the very same time? Yeah. Look at it? Or do you have to shift back and forth? Do you have to shift your focus? Well, you're good, right? Not me. I can move back and forth really quickly, but I actually have to shift my gaze. This is a metaphor for what you're trying to do with these kinds of capacity building strategies. You're trying to actually learn to do two things that look different, that require different kinds of capacities at the same time. And so this is something that can be learned. And part of what we've been doing with the trial court system and also in the law school is not only building people's capacity, but building leadership all through the organization's capacity to build the capacity in others in their court. So by February, I'm gone. I'm gone from the court system. There are judges and chief probation officers and clerks and interpreters that have learned not only how to do this, but also how to integrate this into the way they work day to day, the way they interact with people in their court, the way they interact with each other, and they're the ones who are now bringing this capacity building work to others in the court system. And it turns out that even though with all modesty, I will say I'm more experienced in teaching this capacity building, but it didn't matter because they have more legitimacy. The judges and probation officers have more legitimacy and they get better over time. So this is a strategy, building the capacity to build capacity to do these things, and then integrate that deeply into policy and practice within the court system. Really actually very inspiring to see a white land court judge standing up in front of a very diverse group of judges and probation officers, interpreters, all of whom hold leadership positions at different points in the court system, saying, I didn't know, I never knew that when I identify myself, I don't even talk about my identity as a white man. And now I realize that that has been shaping how everyone interacts with me in my court. And I never had a language to talk about it before. And it's just, it just changed everything. And then actually equipping people to have difficult conversations, courageous conversations, and incorporate that into things that happen in the courthouse, such as disparities in outcomes that are not intended, but that are very observable. And then finally, there is just the last piece of this is designing to engage. And there is part of what's been really powerful and really important is to redefine the boundaries of these institutions so that there are people who are directly connected to these issues who become part of the process of holding institutions accountable. So it really mattered to have judges interacting with the people who never really have gotten access before to the way in which they make their decisions. And then the court system has actually moved to incorporating court users, not during the time they have cases before the court, right, but incorporating people with direct experience of the court system, not only internal to the court system, but into their education and capacity building work and into the design of the way in which they assess their own capacity. And similarly, seeing this in law schools, that really opening up the boundaries of how people are interacting so that we're not only depending on people who have always done things the same way, to push on this work, because, by the way, this is not easy work. I don't want to suggest this is easy work. And part of what has been really important about all of the institutions that I've been working with is that they have to address this issue in order to have legitimacy. And they know they have to do it for the long haul. And otherwise, I think we're just going to be in the same situation that we've been seeing, which is lots of programs, lots of lip service, not much change. So I'm really eager to hear how this lands for you, what questions you have, and your thoughts and experiences and comments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This was a very, very enlightening presentation, and I really hope that my tort students have been listening to this, because I do, in fact, try to teach torts by putting the cases into two different frameworks, and I also teach race and law. And when I teach race and law, I actually look at racial issues from 4 different frameworks, all in an effort to point to the very paradoxes that you're talking about. But having done this for so long, it seems to me that ultimately at the bottom of this is a really fundamental paradox about how we conceptualize ourselves as humans in the world. That in our society, the dominant way of thinking about each other is as self-determined, free-willed individuals. So we develop our own ideas through our own independent process of learning about the world. But of course, the other way to look at ourselves is as products of culture. Yeah. And if you see yourself as an individual, you can't see yourself as a product of a culture, even if that culture is a culture that preaches to you that you're individuals. So I do very much appreciate it, and I think you're exactly right.
I have to get your name so that I can quote and credit you with another paradox. I have to also say you're such a wonderful participant, because I've been seeing, as you look around the room and you're nodding, and it's just so lovely to, so I really appreciate that. I feel, I have a sense that I was in dialogue with you as we were having this conversation, and I think you're absolutely right that, and I see this going on. I teach a course called Lawyering for Change, and students are, struggling with the question, do I have agency? Can I actually make a difference? Or is the system just so big and so entrenched that I can't make a difference? And I think that is another really big paradox, and it's in the negotiation of the space where you can actually both sit in both spaces. There's this thing called, have you ever heard this thing called vent? It's a vent. It's not my idea, but it's basically this, where you have that Venn diagram, and you put one thing on one side of the paradox on one side, and you put the other side of the paradox on the other side, and then you just think about where the point of overlap is and where you can actually be in a third space where you can potentially hold in that space both sides of the paradox. And you can put anything in there. You can actually look this up, VENT, online, and it's a very helpful heuristic for making your point. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. As long as the Black freedom struggle has existed in this country, there has been one response in opposition to it, that the racism of individual whites is basically an indelible, immutable force that will prevent racial progress in this country. And so infamously, William Faulkner, during the civil rights movement, says, you have to go slow with the South. And Thurgood Marshall responds, when they say go slow, they really mean don't go.
Yeah.
And I am a little worried that your framing that focuses on cultural change within elite institutions is actually participating in the, let's call it, Faulknerian tradition. That if we turn away from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if we stop talking about hard legal demands of the power structure, then we're actually conceding that change is not possible, that everything has to be a matter of changing individual consciences, which in the long run is not how racial progress has come about in this country.
Yeah, so I'm curious, hold the mic, because I want to, can you hold the mic? Yeah, thank you. So I'm interested in what led you, because this has happened before, to think that this framework means letting go of legal accountability, of civil rights, of protest. What is it that I said, or what is it about the framework that led you to think that this is the only way, and that this is to the exclusion of legal accountability? And also, I would say legal accountability has only taken, I don't think legal accountability has taken us very far. I think it's been protest and protest and movements that then
absolutely.
Law has sometimes watered down, and especially looking at the courts now. I actually agree with you that if this is the only thing that was done, that we would not make progress. And also that people wouldn't believe in this process, because if something is happening that is racist, overt, and there isn't an interest on the part of the institution in dealing with it, and you say, well, let's just talk, you're going to completely delegitimate any kind of effort. So the challenge, I think, is to figure out how you do these things at the same time, how you simultaneously, have your lawsuits and your pressure coming from the outside, while you are also building collaborations with those who are interested in actually trying to change the institutions, because I don't think you're going to change with one or the other. I think you're only going to change with both. But I must have said something that would have led you to believe that I think that this is the model, and so I do think that people in the institution, to move forward, have to build this capacity to hold these contradictory things. And if they don't, well, then you sue them, then you protest, you pressure, until there's people who are in positions of influence within an institution, like a law school or like a court system, that actually really want to deal with the issue. So I'm very curious.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can respond, but then I definitely want to give up the mic because I understand that time is limited. But I would say I see that danger of not only adding to, but actually subtracting from the kind of legacy of confrontational civil rights movement in reframing what I would call conflicts as paradoxes. Because a lot of the paradoxes that you described, I would more view as basically power struggles between people who do not want to see racial progress within the organization and people who do. And when you reframe as a paradox, I'm worried that basically it's not accurate, and that by sort of obscuring the underlying conflict, it will lead to political demobilization.
Yeah, and I just have one other thing to say, which is read the letter of the letter from the city of Birmingham jail. Again, and this is exactly how Martin Luther King frames what he's doing there now. Maybe, and Mari Matsuda. Any of you read When the Quail Calls? It's a really powerful critical race theory piece that's about double consciousness, and she uses, she uses the same framework. So I think this is a really important conversation to have, and the idea that you actually can't make progress unless you both protest. Part of the reason you're protesting is to get people to the table, and if you're only protesting, nothing's going to change, but you will actually demonstrate what the problem is. So. So we could have a lot to talk about. I really appreciate it. Yeah. See someone over there?
So similar to the previous comment, I had the sense that I was worried that this wouldn't ultimately lead to changes. So a way to ask about whether this ultimately leads to changes is, what about your outcomes? Have you looked at outcomes? Does the Yale Law Journal leadership look any different as a result? Do the courts look any different? Do people feel any different in these institutions? Is there reason for hope about this particular procedural model?
Yeah. So I just want to say, I don't think it's only a procedural model, because I think there are real outcome goals here. So I think it's both a process and a substance model. And I also think you're asking exactly the right question, right? If this is just people talking and, feeling good about talking, and that nothing changes in the kinds of decisions, the ways in which people interact, in the kinds of outcomes, then this is, this is problematic and worse than doing nothing. So I would say it's a little too soon to say ultimate outcomes. And I will also say that I've not tracked the outcomes for the Yale Law Journal, so you're telling me that I need to go back and do that. But with the court system, there have been short-term outcomes. And I can give both a narrative to illustrate the short-term outcomes, and then also, these things take time. But for example, equipped with this, with some of these skills, there was a woman of color, chief probation officer, who learned of. Who heard a specific instance of someone who was sentenced to jail on what he perceived as the exact same set of facts and he was a person of color, that a white person was released on, without any sentence. This individual went and watched. This individual said she would not have felt empowered to do anything previously. She went and watched this judge sentence over a period of a week or 2 weeks, and then went in and basically sat down with the judge with her data and said to the judge, I really respect you. I think you are someone who cares a lot about justice. And this was a complaint that was raised with one of the probationers, and I went in and sat with you and watched, and I saw a pattern. I saw a pattern here. And initially the judge was, resistant. And then they agreed they would come back to get again in 3 months. The judge went and looked at his own data and saw that he had a pattern of actually disparate sentencing, particularly, disparate sentencing, and then both instituted an accountability system for himself, and then also raised this with other judges in the court system so that they would begin to actually watch the patterns that they were actually engaging in as they were sentencing. And then that started a dialogue about what are the things that they're looking at that are leading them, for example, what kind of, so that's a specific instance. This has now been integrated. So a lot of the short-term results are more, we have anecdotes. We're going to have to look over a period of 5 years. This has been integrated into the strategic plan. I don't want to sugarcoat this. I mean, there's lots of pushback. There's lots of, and at the same time that all of this is happening, one of the reasons I think that there is hope for this is that they're also being investigated by the Justice Department at the same time that all this stuff is going on. So these things are not the only thing that's going on. There's protests, there's newspaper coverage, but the question is, what are they going to do in response to that? And at least with respect to something like a law school or a justice system, you're not going to fix this with a rule. This is day-to-day decision-making by lots of people who have to shift their mindset. And so I think you really, I think your skepticism is appropriate and important. And I also think that, these processes are crucial if you're going to combine the pressure that comes from litigation and protest and public exposure with meaningful change in institutional practice. So I think you need both. And probably need to make that more explicit in the way I present this.
Thank you. My question is whether you're...
Where are you?
I'm sorry. I'm in the back.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether your paradigm is also intended to apply to an institutional context of sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. So say you have an organization where women are claiming that sexual harassment is prevalent throughout the organization. I've had trouble figuring out what the paradox would be there and what the sort of both and solution would be with respect to alleged harassers and claimed harassment victims.
Yeah. So let me just first say that I don't believe that this paradigm would apply across necessarily every kind of institution. So we'd have to situate the question of sexual harassment in a context, right, in order to ask the question, because, an institution where you have that's purely bottom line oriented, there can still be a purpose with respect to sexual harassment. So, but let's just put it in the context of an institution that has determined that it could be a law school, it could be a court system, it could be a law firm, that the capacity of people to actually interact openly and effectively in the workplace actually is very important. It's important to retention. It's important to people having a sense of the legitimacy of the organization. It's important, if we think about this in the context of law school, it's really important that, or universities more generally, which are one big place where this is really coming up, it's really important that people can have the capacity to actually deal with hard problems that affect whether they can fully participate, period. So there is, these are supposed to be learning environments in which people can learn with and from each other and have some sense that they can do so in a way in which their safety and identity will be protected. So in an institution where those kinds of things actually matter, there is a kind of broader frame potentially for, or even thinking about how people interact. If you think about colleges, how do people interact in a setting where they're simultaneously getting involved with each other in intimate ways while they're also interacting with each other in and out of class, in workplaces. So if you don't have any capacity, I see this happening in my own institution. If you have not built any capacity to have conversations about any sensitive issue, you can't go to anyone to get any kind of help around how to deal with issues of difficult social interactions or power or status or political disagreements. You can deal with the serious harasser after it happens, but you're going to have a really hard time dealing with getting people together to engage with the cultural conditions that are making it likely that people will engage in sexual harassment over a long period of time. So I think the same kind of framework could potentially apply there, both that I am not suggesting that that is a substitute for holding people accountable or protesting to the extent that institutions are not taking these kinds of issues seriously. But what I do see in higher education institutions, in court systems, in workplaces, is that the failure to conceptualize this as about anything other than sexual harassment has meant that the kinds of change that needs to happen in organizations for them to actually build the conditions where you could build a culture where sexual harassment is not accepted have not been, those kinds of relationships, those kinds of practices have not been built. So you're continually refacing the most egregious issues, and it's really difficult to get people to deal with the longer term questions. So I think it's a similar kind of paradigm, a similar kind of challenge. I don't.
That's time, so please join me in thanking